Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Harold here with another edition of Those Are the Days Extended. Today I am taking you back to March 3rd, 1994, where Billy and Austin were shocked to learn that Kate could be their mother. If you see this pic here, it actually is some stills from the infamous Curtis Reed trial, where it was revealed that Kate, in this iteration played by the lovely talented Deborah Adair, she was revealed to be one of Curtis, or revealed to be Curtis's ex-wife, and that's what sort of got the wheels turning, especially with Billy and Austin. Of like, wait, could this woman be our dead mother, who we thought was dead and long gone? And of course, you see Vivian and Yvonne in the mix, and Laura in the mix, who actually do know that she is their mother and are kind of keeping it quiet and letting it all be revealed during this infamous trial back in the early 90s. But this sort of sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. We're going to talk a little bit about Kate and her relationship to her children, all 6/7 of them, and we'll see soon why I say 7. But first, I want to start with a little bit of a history of the character of Kate. And many don't know, and I think this is sometimes can be a little confusing when you look up who Kate is if you're not familiar with her history and who she is. But Kate Roberts, who we know as Kate Roberts, is actually interesting enough. She's an amalgamation of actually two different characters. They basically took a character who used to be on the show in the 70s. They kind of took her history with this addition of this new character named Kate Roberts, and they sort of melded them together and put their histories together. So that's why I think a lot of times, if you'll look up the character, just wondering who was she and how'd she get to Salem and what are her connections, you'll get those histories put together that may not make as much sense. But to let you know, yes, there was, when we first see our Kate Roberts in the early 90s, she's introduced again in the form of Deborah Adair. But the old Kate is a character from the late 70s. Her name was Kate Winograd. She was actually a doctor, anesthesiologist at University Hospital. She was actually played by here Elaine Princey in the blue. And you also see there's Joe Mascalo as Stefano, and there is Miranda Wilson as Megan in that pic too. But yeah, Elaine was on the show as a character named Kate. She has an affair in the late 70s with Bill Horton and caused sort of this trouble in his marriage to Laura. She eventually sort of leaves town after a couple of years, but she has some dalliances with Bill and a couple other characters. I think Neil Curtis at one point too. But she eventually sort of leaves Salem and doesn't come back, and that's sort of the end of that. And she sort of created this, again, strife and ripple in Bill's marriage to Laura. But when they bring Arcade on in the 90s, again, they basically give her that history of Kate, but instead they change it a little bit. They basically they kept the part of the affair. They took away the fact that she was a doctor, and they made her again this sort of lonely wife. And the reason she sort of was in Bill Horton's orbit now, because they took away the fact that she was now a doctor. She was actually there because she was best friends with a young psychiatrist named Marlena Evans. So that's how you get that Kate and Marlena friendship. It goes all the way back to the 70s when they were sort of very, very young, starting out. Kate was a doctor. I mean, Marlena was a doctor. Kate was sort of a lonely, unfortunately abused wife at the time, and that's how when she reintroduced herself in the 90s, and we see her, that's why when Victor brings her to town, we see that she has this connection to Marlena because they are old friends from back then. So that's sort of the history of Kate's character. You didn't know. I know a lot of people sometimes get confused, and if you look up her biography, sometimes it'll say doctor in it, but that's where that all comes from. She's actually, again, an amalgamation of two different characters sort of put together to kind of push the storyline forward. But yeah, sort of delving a little bit into her relationships. I'm going to start with her like first set of kids, I'll say. In this picture here, we'll see this is sort of the Reed Roberts family. Of course, we see her two oldest is Austin, Billy, and Lucas. And the history there, of course, we know she was in an abusive marriage to Curtis Reed. She kind of saw solace and was actually a bit taken advantage of by Bill Horton, prominent doctor at the university. Again, she was sort of in his orbit because her best friend was Marlena at the time, who was a psychiatrist who worked with Bill. But yeah, she has the affair with Bill. gets pregnant. Curtis finds out. He sort of loses it, attacks her, and basically leaves her on the side of the road to die. Um, Kate, she of course survives and comes back to sort of wanting to reclaim her children. And it takes her maybe a couple years to sort of find Curtis. At this point, he's sort of faked the kid's death and he renames them, and that's where their names Austin and Billy come from. And that's sort of why when Kate comes back to the show in the 90s, she, of course, is not familiar with the names and doesn't recognize them as her children because Curtis has actually renamed them. So, yes, Austin and Billy are not their original names. And we've never actually found out what their original names were. But yeah, that was sort of the storyline then. Desperate as a single mom, pregnant with what we find out is Lucas, she sort of turns to this uh, way to sort of make money and sort of survive. She becomes, as we know, sort of this high class prostitute with Stefano as her pimp, no less, which will actually come back in a much bigger way down the line. But so yeah, she sort of takes that money. We find out she sort of puts Lucas through private and military school with that money. She also takes the money she earns, puts herself through business school, and sort of reinvents herself as this sort of stern, really smart, capable businesswoman. And that's what attracts Victor Kiriakis to begin with. And he hires her, of course, when she comes back to Salem in the 90s, he hires her to sort of run Titan Publishing. So that's what brings her and Lucas sort of back on the canvas when we are officially introduced to her as Kate Roberts, played by Deborah Adair back then. But yeah, we have witnessed Lucas and Kate sort of are the quintessential sort of mother and son duo. We know they're like the epitome of ride or die. We see that until Philip comes along, which we'll talk about in a minute. He is the only child that she got to sort of raise and build that parent-child relationship from the beginning. So that's why we see here why they are arguably the closest of all of Kate's children. And we've seen that play out over the years, specifically in the 90s. And whether Lucas and Brian Datillo are on the show or off the show, I think that relationship has always held strong. They've had a few bumps in the road, but he is the quintessential mama's boy to Kate's sort of domineering mother. When it comes to Austin and Billy, I think Austin very much fell in line with the idea of Kate as his mom and having her as his mother. I think he always yearned and wanted that, and so that dynamic was very seamless with putting them together. And actually, Austin, which I know a lot of people don't remember, but he's sort of the catalyst for the Sammy Kate war in the beginning. I know people think about it. I think we attach that to Lucas because Lucas sort of carried it on, but it was actually Austin who sort of started that, at least in Kate's eyes. It was the fact that Sammy, for lack of a better term, raped and took advantage of Austin that sort of set Sammy and Kate on this path of being enemies for a while until they eventually made up 20 something years later. But yeah, that's sort of where it started. It was her defense of her son Austin, not Lucas at the time. And then Lucas, of course, carried it through with being Will's dad back then. But Kate and Austin have always had a really good relationship. Now, Billy, on the other hand, I think Kate has always had, and we'll get into more with her other sons, a really good relationship with the boys. It's the girls and her daughters that have sort of been tricky. We see with Kate and Billy, we saw sort of the growing pains of that relationship when she found out Billy was sort of the one resistant to Kate, and it really took them a while to get their relationship on track. And through the years, it's been on and off, and they have that stereotypical sort of mother daughter relationship, but there's still love there and closeness. So yeah, that was sort of the first set of her children, which I think she has a little bit of a different relationship with the others. Moving next into, of course, Philip. Now, this actually is for us viewers the only child we, the audience, got to see from literally conception into through the years, Sora's notwithstanding. I think Philip has always been a really interesting sort of mix of both of his parents, and this is the only child that we actually saw Kate parent or co-parent with another parent with. And so that dynamic has always been interesting too. I think Philip is, again, he's a perfect mix of Kate and Victor, who are both headstrong go-getters, and I think he gets that from them. I think We've seen Philip lean a little bit more towards Kate in terms of protection, but a little bit more towards Victor in terms of style and sort of ruthlessness and things like that. And they've always played with that dynamic. So I think this one is always interesting because yes, Philip very much falls in line. I think more on the Lucas side with sort of being a mama's boy and having that relationship with Kate, but also we got to see the dynamic of the push and pull when Kate and Victor either weren't getting along or on opposite sides. We saw that sort of dynamic, and that dynamic we didn't really see with the other kids. With Bill Horton, he was always off canvas, so Lucas was always hers. Curtis Reed was dead at the time, so Kate sort of got to enjoy this strained but eventually loving relationship with Austin and Billy. So that dynamic with Philip was always interesting. But moving on to this next set of children, I say it's two, but I say three. They sort of come courtesy of Stefano DiMera in one way or another. First, we have Rex and Cassie, who were the infamous Gemini twins at the time. And this was an interesting storyline, if you remember, back in the early 2000s. Cassie and Rex were test tube babies. They were raised in a facility by Stefano. They were kept away from their parents, who were Kate and Roman. But when they were first introduced, it was thought that they were actually DiMeras, and they were going down that path with Tony and Marlena as their parents. And Marlena actually remembered sort of giving birth to them, so that sort of led the credence of they were Tony and Marlena's kids, and they were dealing with that. And then it was actually revealed that, which was actually a really good use of history. I know people don't always love this storyline by the way it started out. It started out a little kind of funky and goofy with them being sort of, or the idea that they were like aliens, and that was sort of debunked, and it was a really sort of weird way to introduce these two characters. But I think they finally got them down when they sort of revealed that they were Kate and Roman's, and it played in a lot of the history that Kate, Roman, and Marlena had with Stefano. We find out that, of course, he obtained Kate's eggs, he obtained Roman's sperm, made an embryo, implanted that embryo in Marlena, and she actually gave birth to them when she was off canvas. Which again, nice nod to history, when Stefano had kidnapped her in the late 80s/early 90s. And so made it perfect timing for Marlena to give birth to them, come back to the show, and then sort of get with John and have Belle. And that's why the Gemini twins, Cassie and Rex, are sort of in the same age group as Belle and Sean at that time. So I think it started out rough and rocky with the storyline, but I think they seamlessly sort of integrated them, at least plot wise, into the history of the show, which was really good. And then we have, of course, Kate's non-biological son, but just as equally important, and that is Chad DiMera. This one's interesting because we saw Kate sort of develop this mother-son relationship with someone who she wasn't biologically related to, which I think was a nice twist. And then this sort of started, of course, back when Chad was first introduced on the show, played by Casey Dudrick at that time. Kate was married to Stefano. We find out that Chad's mom is Madeline, who's a former prostitute who used to work with Kate for Stefano back then. And sort of Kate was the catalyst and the domineering force with bringing sort of Chad into the family. Again, we did get these scenes of Chad and Stefano sort of bonding and becoming, but it wasn't really until Casey Dudrick left the show and the character of Chad got hurt and was in Boston for a while recovering, that they built up that relationship. Up until then, it really was, for the most part, centered around Kate's relationship with Chad and sort of her bringing him in as an outsider and sort of acclimating him to the family and getting him to really trust Stefano and trust the rest of the family. So I like the fact that they stood ground with that and kept that, even though, of course, the DiMeras sort of disbanded for a little while, and then we had the passing of Joe Mascalo. They sort of kept this relationship up, and I think it was seamless in terms of having Kate take over that role. We know she's been the quintessential sort of pushy, domineering mom, and so for her to take over for Madeline in Chad's life, I think has been a really nice character development, not only for her but also for Chad in this way. So yeah, that's why I sort of included Chad in the 7 children that Kate has. Of course, we've seen she's had much more sort of loving, close relationships with the sons. The daughters, maybe not so much. Again, we haven't seen Cassie in years. there was that storyline a few years ago, or at least we thought that when Chriselle Stiles came on, she was actually going to be Cassie, and then it turned out to go into different directions. So yeah, Cassie's been named a few times. Her name comes up every once in a while, and hopefully we'll get that relationship to play out on screen as both adult women. But until then, yeah, that has sort of been Kate in the walk down memory lane with all seven of her children and the unique and interesting relationships she has with them. But yeah, and they continue to this day. So yeah, that was another edition. Those are the days extended. Thanks everyone.
Those were the